What do you say we read the scriptures today? We're at probably one of the most famous places in all of the Old Testament and Genesis in particular today. And where do we leave off? I know that was 2 weeks ago. This is where we left off, right here. Under the tamarisk tree down in Beersheba, Abraham planted a tamarisk tree at Beersheba, and there he called on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. So at the last time we saw Abraham, he was in the bottommost. This is as far south as you go in the nation of Israel, so that in your learned reading of the Old Testament from this point on, many times it'll say this applies to the entirety of Israel from Dan to Beersheba, north to south. So Beersheba is the farthest place in the south. I know. Well, we'll just go with it. Don't worry about it. I'll just speak loud. That's where we left him, staying and having confirmation that the farthest southmost point really was the geography God had given, and there he had given confirmation. Today, it gets crazy. So let's just see where we're at. We're in chapter 22. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham! Got his name right. And he said, here I am. And he said, take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I'll tell you. Now, why is this goofy? Why is this crazy? Well, because all the chapters we've been reading recently, Abraham tries to fix the problem about the fact that God's not getting engaged in the problem and actually providing an heir, a child that was going to be through whom all the blessings are going to come. And, they did the Ishmael thing that came through Hagar, a lot of bad ideas. And now finally Isaac is born. Isaac's alive. Isaac's a teenager about this time. He is the one through whom God says all these promises are going to come. And then God says, kill him. So that's the problem. So what are you supposed to do as Abraham? Are you supposed to say, is this a trick question? What am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to stand up and say, nay, God, never shall it be that thou wilt take the life of the one through whom the promises will come? Or do you say, okay, I'm out of here? That's right. This just seems crazy. So this is the conflict we start in today. Yeah, did I do wrong? Did I screw up and suddenly all the plans are off? So not only are the plans and the promises not going to go on, but my son's going to die as a result? Well, that's the drama that we start today with. What do you do? So Abraham rose early in the morning, and he saddled his donkey, and he took 2 of his young men with him, and Isaac his son, and he split wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. The writer of Genesis doesn't even hint of the fact that Abraham stopped and thought about it for a second. God says, do this. He says, okay, next morning we're out of here. Really? Yeah, really. And now you're starting to see an Abraham with a mature faith or a maturing faith. It's as though he's saying, in the past I've had circumstances where God said this was going to happen, and yet it took so long for God to do what he promised. I made some missteps. I did some wrong things. But now I suppose if God says to do something, even if I don't fully understand it, let's go with it. So he just obeys. He just obeys. Now the section in Hebrews 11 that Bob read for us this morning actually gives a clue into what he was thinking at the time. We'll look at that more as we go on. So, but as according to the narrative, he just does it. He collects together what he needs, and they go. So, on the third day, verse 4, Abraham raised his eyes, saw the place from a distance, and Abraham said to the young men with him, stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you. So they get to where they're supposed to go, which, by the way, there's some controversy about this, but about 80% of scholars agree with this. This place, Moriah, is not the wind they call Moriah. Just got to get that out of the way real fast. It's a synonym for the place where the temple would eventually be built in Jerusalem, in what is present-day Jebus for them, in Jerusalem, that same place. That's it. And to this very day, if you go to Jerusalem and you look at that big gold dome thing that's in the middle of Jerusalem, it's called the Dome of the Rock. It's a Muslim, second most famous, important Muslim place. Inside the Dome of the Rock, and we've talked about this before, on the floor of the Dome of the Rock is a rock. It's just a rock outcropping. It's a big old piece of limestone that pokes out of the floor. So when you go in the Dome of the Rock, you can walk around the inside walls of the Dome of the Rock. It's all carpeted with these nice Persian carpets and stuff like that. Actually, they're Arab. They wouldn't want Persian. Persian's bad. They don't like, but they're in carpets. And then there's a wrought iron, small waist-high wrought iron fence right inside that. And in the center of that, almost the entire square footage inside the Dome of the Rock is just a big old piece of limestone coming out of the floor. Really? Yeah. And so both the Muslims and Christians and Jews See that spot, that rock outcropping is the place where this took place. Ooh. Islam also thinks that's the place that Muhammad went off to heaven on his white horse and kicked off a place in Jerusalem, knocked off a piece of stone and went to heaven. They think that's that rock too. Okay, so stay here. I'm going to go up. Now look what he says. I and the lad will go over there and we will worship and return to you. Is he saying they're both going to return to them? It sort of sounds like it. Yeah. To tell you the truth, in Hebrew, it's a little vague grammatically, but it has probably more of merit that it means both of them. He's not letting on that there's actually going to be a sacrifice that's going to happen. We're going to go over there, we're going to worship. We're going to sing a couple of Chris Tomlin songs. No, but we're going to go worship over there, and then we're done worshiping, we're going to come back here, and, he acts like this is all routine. This is all routine. So what happens? Well, Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering, laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife, so the two of them walked on together. So he takes the wood that he split back at home, puts it on Isaac's shoulders and said, "Here, boy, carry this." And then Abraham takes both the knife that he's going to do the sacrifice and the fire. Usually had a little iron pot, is what you'd have. And you'd have coals from the previous night's fire inside. That's what the carrying the fire is all about. So they go off that way. And by the way, too, during that time and eventually throughout the nation of Israel, it goes much later, generations later, the way that you dispatched an animal that you were going to eat or sacrifice was by slitting its throat. And so that's why the knife. It's not, it's just kind of, go like this. That was a humane way because for them, the animal really wasn't struggling. The animal just sort of passes out and then dies. So you're not really aware of your own death. In Israel, subsequent to this, when they did sacrifices, and when the Passover lamb was sacrificed during what we read today when Jesus has his upper room, those lambs that were sacrificed were dispatched the same way. So that's what Abraham's got. He's got the knife, and he's got the fire. Why didn't his son speak up? You're so good. Look at this. He did speak up. Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, "My father." And he said, "Here I am, my son." And he said, "Okay, behold the fire and the wood. Okay, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" Tough question. Now what do you say? Yeah, that's right. It's really a tough moment. Because even if Abraham is operating under a good understanding of what's going to happen, or some sense by faith that God can do miraculous things, regardless of what he's going to take off to do here, Isaac doesn't have that same kind of faith, really. He doesn't understand God the same way. So even if Abraham tells him and just spills the beans right here, he can't handle the truth, probably. So you got to be very careful right here. So what does he say? Verse 8, Abraham says, "God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." That's a good answer. In fact, he's saying, today we are providing the knife, the wood, the fire. God's providing the sacrifice. Now, if you don't know the rest of the story, even at just this moment right here, is that true? Because even though we know Isaac is the targeted sacrifice at this point, Isaac was provided by God. So he's saying, we just do this stuff, Isaac. God provides the lamb. God provides the sacrifice. Okay? Well, yeah, it keeps him in the dark a little bit. But he's saying God's the one God's dealing with that problem, Isaac, so don't worry about it. So the two of them walked on together. That was good enough for Isaac. See, for me, if I was writing the Bible, this discussion would have gone on a couple of paragraphs. So what exactly do you mean he's going to provide a lamb? I mean, how come we don't have a lamb already? I would have, but we don't go there. So that's good. That's why I didn't write the Bible. Verse 9, then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there, arranged the wood, bound his son Isaac, laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand, took the knife to slay his son. I really like this picture. It's done by Rembrandt, by the way. Rembrandt did it. So at this point, Isaac has got it figured out. It looks, I know. He's got his hand on him. He's got the knife ready to go. And as in the sacrifices in Israel, you would slit the throat of the sacrifice. Many times you would catch the blood for ceremonial purposes, like at Passover in Egypt when they collected the blood from the sacrifice and used that like paint to mark the doors into their house. And then while the animal was still there, you would light the fire and you'd burn the animal. So that's why he's on top of the wood.
Isaac in there looks like I don't know how old was
In his early teens is what we think.
early teens.
Yeah.
I couldn't picture myself doing that to my grandson.
Yeah.
Seriously, and the kid is in that picture is crying out. I mean, but yet in Scripture it doesn't talk about him crying out.
No.
Well, that's just Rembrandt.
This is Rembrandt's interpretation.
It's his rendition, but
However, we do know that Abraham had to bind up Isaac. This picture is actually called the binding of Isaac. Had to tie him up, because once he gets on top of that wood and Abraham whips out his knife, he's going to figure it out. So that's why I think it's probably not a bad interpretation that he's terrified. I would be terrified. Yeah. Now, in Isaac's mind, I've always wondered this as well. We don't have any recording of this, but don't you think that Abraham, as Isaac's growing up, that Abraham would tell Isaac, do you know how special you are? Do you know that we couldn't have a baby, but God did this, and you're the baby that God brought us? And through you, this promise to bless all the nations is going to come through you. Do you know how special you are? And you hear that over and over again, and then this day, you're going to die? I don't get it. So I think he's clearly whacked out. I mean, he just doesn't know what to think. Just doesn't know what to think. Yeah. Or he could be thinking, what did we do so wrong? Because this is not turning out the way I thought it was going to go. I mean, something's really badly wrong. Until that hand right, can I do it? There. Okay? This hand shows up. Verse 11, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, oh, here I am. By the way, that's an ancient figure of speech is what it is. It's if someone calls your name back then, what you would say literally in the Hebrew is, you're looking at me. It's like you see me. Behold. So in many of your versions, it might say behold, because it literally means you're looking at me. So it's a way of getting attention. It's undivided attention. The word is Hanani. So he'd say, Abraham would say, Hanani, I'm here. Okay, so that's what he does. What does he say? Verse 12, he said, don't stretch out your hand against the lad and do nothing to him, for now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son. So really what we see here, this is a test in a real sense. It's a way of saying, do you fear God, which means more than just afraid of him. It's not only being very respectful of his power, but also very respectful and obedient about what he commands, and him being the sovereign of the universe and everything. I know that now that's where you put God, because you could have withheld your son and you didn't. How does he qualify it? Your only son. Now you have to understand too, there's an issue when you have families coming up through the ancient times. Everything about family was producing offspring so that the offspring could take care of you. Sort of. Many of them died, and so having many children was a big deal, so that some of them will survive into adulthood and support you. But when you have one child, one son, he is your entire hope of the future. He is your hope in your old age. And so looking at Isaac, it could very well be the case that Abraham would look at this boy that never should have existed and say, he is my only hope. He's the one who will care for me. You know, I will not obey God because I want this child for my purposes, not for God's purposes. And that's the fundamental conflict going on right here. Does Abraham want to preserve who Isaac is so he can serve him? Because it's his last chance. After all, at this point, Abraham is 100 teens. I mean, he's somewhere around 115. His wife is 10 years younger. They're not having any more kids. It shouldn't have had this one. So there's the conflict. Do I preserve my son? Do I withhold him from God so that he can serve me in my old age? Or do I give him up by actually killing him? And the angel says, speaking God, says, now I understand. That's not your heart. Your heart is not to withhold him for your purposes. Your heart is to give him to me. And if I say sacrifice him, you say, okay. Abraham's faith has just shot through the roof, is what this is. This is an extraordinary thing for him to do this. And the angel goes on. He does. That's right, 13. Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went up, took the ram, and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it will be provided. So, problem solved. He looks over and sees an animal stuck. Actually, this picture on the left is an animal in Iraq that is stuck in a thicket. It's a goat, but no, that's okay. We'll go for that. Because they normally, I read about this. I'd never known this before. Well, it's a ram, but that would be a male sheep or a male goat. What's a male goat? Is that a ram too? I don't think so. Billy. I don't know the word Billy in the Old Testament, so it's a ram. But in the Middle East at this time, because of the way growth happens on low-lying trees is what it is. The branches, the stuff on the ground gets eaten away. So these goats and these sheep are to this very day, they actually go up on their hind legs like this, and they start eating out of the tree. And sometimes if they have big horns, they get stuck and they can't get out of them. And that's exactly what's going on. We have a goat, a sheep that's stuck because of the ram horns in the tree. And Abraham sacrifices him instead, does the burnt offering, and he calls that place, sure enough, just like he told Isaac, the Lord will provide. The Lord will provide. The Lord's got an answer here. He wants a sacrifice. I don't know how this is going to work because it's got to come through Isaac, the promise. God will figure it out. It's God's problem. It's not mine. God will provide. So if you... Could be.
Because,
Could be.
You know, when we are younger, in our teens and growing, I know my faith wasn't that great until I got older. The older I get, the stronger my faith gets.
Yeah.
I know He will provide.
Yeah.
So I have to wonder, maybe He did this more
For Isaac. Yeah.
so that Isaac's faith suddenly becomes where Abraham.
Yeah, surely there's no way Isaac could have gone through this and not been impacted somehow and really got it somehow. Yeah. You see it happen all through the Old Testament. Moses' right-hand man, as they came in and did battle in the Promised Land, they started battling all the bad guys and stuff like that. His right-hand man, you know his name. It's Joshua. Well, Joshua is the one who's down in the battlefield on that day when Moses is up on the hill. And remember, God says, if you hold your hands up, you'll succeed. They had to have guys holding Moses' hands in the air. And as long as Moses' hands were in the air, there was victory on the battlefield. When Moses' hands got tired, they went down. They, would go bad on the battlefield. Well, the guy fighting in the battlefield was Joshua. Think he remembered that day? Keep your hands up, because God's the one who protects us. So it happens all the way through. God will provide, as it said in this day. By the way, there's a title for God that's actually coined right here, Jehovah Jireh. Have you heard that term? That's what God will provide means, Jehovah Jireh. God will provide. Now, you have to understand, it's a fascinating thing. Here's a place where I think Abraham is confused about what God's asking. I think there might be some great mystery to him in this, but he knows that God's in charge. He knows that God has this planned. He knows that God's very good to his word. He understands already that God told him that this promise is going to come through his son, and not just a slave that lives in his house, but through the very product of he and Sarah. I mean, it's got to be this way. He knows these things, but I'm not sure he's got it all figured out. I really empathize with him because there's places in our lives where we get to a point where it seems like God's asking us to go right, but it seems like left makes more sense. And we don't totally understand why it is that where God's taking us or what he's doing seems very out of sync with our expectations. And yet with time, you tend to say, well, God, I don't get this, but I'm going to do what you say because I know that you got a bigger picture than I've got. I know that you understand what's going down here. I'll go with you on this. Let's see what happens. That was very much the fact when I actually came to the Lord. And the Lord called me. I followed him. And I said, I don't know exactly where you're going. I don't know what's in store for me from this point on. Please, God, don't let me have to talk in front of people. And I'm not kidding. That's very much the case. And you just don't know, and you don't want to know that, actually, because if you knew it at that point, like Isaac, you'd go running away with your hair on fire. But you say in the very small faith that you say, God, I don't really get it. I can't answer all the questions. I'm clearly out of control about my future and in my present, but I know you love me, and I know you're in charge. I'll do what you say. And I think that's where Abraham is right here. Very much like that right here. And God provides. And God provides. Then the angel of the Lord has a second thing, called Abraham a second time from heaven, and said this, by myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you've done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son. And before I go on, this is actually God speaking through the angel. By the way, the word angel just literally means messenger. It means messenger. All angel means is messenger. So the message of God coming through is, he says, God himself is speaking through the angel and says, by myself I have sworn, which I like that, because in ancient times, when you're going to actually make a promise to somebody, you swore by somebody. You say, in the name of, we watched Galaxy Quest the other night. Grepflar's hammer? Yeah, okay, anyway. You swear by some god, basically. But God doesn't do that right here. He swears by himself, because there is no one greater. I just love that. It's a way of going like this to the ancient world. God swore by himself because he's the biggest guy that there is. In fact, it's quoted here in Hebrews 6, when God made the promise to Abraham, since he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself, saying, I will surely bless you and I will surely multiply you. It's kind of cool. So God says, based on my authority and my sovereignty, this is what I say. During the New Testament time, Paul as a Pharisee, when Paul would teach as a Pharisee, he would never just speak for himself. He would always say, Rabbi Gamaliel has always said, blah, 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 blah. It's the same kind of thing. You spoke in someone else's authority. You made promises on someone else's authority. Many times they made promises based on the temple, On the basis of this temple being here, I promise you the next Friday we will, And that happens in the New Testament. You see Jesus saying, you're swearing by the temple? Are you kidding me? So that's what goes on. Here God swears by himself and says, because you've done this thing and have not withheld your son, your only son, which would be what he'd be tempted to do if he wanted to use Isaac for himself. 17, indeed, because you've done this, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore, and your seed shall possess the gate of their enemies. Now I read that and I said, wait a second. Didn't God already promise that? So why is he promising it again? Maybe for the sake of Isaac? Yeah, that could be. Did you have something, Linda? Just thinking out loud? Well, I was thinking out loud on this. I thought, it's kind of odd. It's really kind of odd. I thought that was a done deal. We went past this whole thing a couple weeks ago about God saying, this is how it's going to happen, and you've agreed. And by the way, there was that time when Abraham's standing up in front of the stars at night, and he gets a bing, a light goes off in his head, and God says, because you believed, I'm going to count that as righteousness to you. So I thought this was a done deal right here. Well, we'll get to this in a second. Maybe it wasn't a done deal in Abraham's mind. Maybe Abraham, once he got hold of a son, a real son, the temptation was there to forget about the promise from God and go with the promise of an heir. Maybe that's what was playing off here. So God had to see exactly where he was at. But God knew his heart. God doesn't need this test. God knows his heart. So who needs the test? Abraham does. He needs to understand. Same thing in school. I mean, you get quizzes and tests in school. Part of it is so the teacher can grade it, but part of it is that you can understand how ignorant you still are and what you are accomplishing. The test is really good for you as well. This test was for Abraham, so he would understand the hidden parts of his heart. Is my heart actually placing its trust in my heir apparent, Isaac, or am I still fully given to God? Here's a great test to figure that out. Yeah.
Reading, when I was a kid, I always read the Bible. I read a chapter. And this always puzzled me. Not really puzzled me, but I kind of got it. And Jesus, there's a parallel there.
Yeah.
Until I became a parent of my one. Could I do that? Could I do that? Maybe I could. Okay. No, I could never do that. I could never do
sorry. I honest, if I were to be truly honest in my heart, and God asked me to do that,
Especially if your entire adult life, you and your wife had given up the hope of ever having a child. You got way on in years, 90 and 100. And you said, you know what, I guess it's not going to happen for us. We're never going to have heirs. There's never going to be anyone that takes care of us. We're going to die in pain and suffering out here in tents in the middle of nowhere. It's kind of a hopeless future. And frankly, in ancient culture, it was a curse. It was a curse. And so now this boy comes and he fixes the curse. I'll tell you, it's got to be a tremendous temptation on Abraham's part to want to just brace his kid and say, no, he's mine. He's mine. He's not yours. He's mine. Now, it's interesting because as God works out his plans in our lives, many times he blesses you with something as magnanimous as a son like this, an answer to prayer. He blesses you, and the temptation is always there for us to embrace the gift more than the giver once you get it in your hands. And that's kind of where Abraham's right here right now. You've got this incredible gift, but are you still willing to let go of that in order to embrace God's promise over the tangible promise of an heir? That's the deal right here. And he does.
it also parallels what God given his only begotten Son.
That's right. And we'll look at that in a second. Yeah.
Sacrificed him for us.
Yeah.
And I can't help but see that glaring parallel.
Yeah. Good. Because that's what the writer wants you to catch. Yeah. We'll see in a second. Yeah. We'll see in a second. Okay, let's move on. In your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you've obeyed my voice. Now, the writer in the New Testament tells us that seed is Jesus. And through Jesus, that seed, all the nations will be blessed. And this is an interesting connection right here. There's a little mystery right here. But what he's saying is that, Abraham, because you did this, the message and the power of who this seed will be in Jesus, this promise, which will be fulfilled for everybody, is coming because today you decided to let go of your son. Because you decided to let your son be sacrificed and killed. Because you decided the son wasn't about you, it was about God's will. And because of that, all the nations are blessed. Get any connections yet with the New Testament? Okay, let's move on. So Abraham returned to his young men. They rose, they went together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. By the way, that's a picture, that's a drawing from, it's an engraving from 1860 when a guy actually went down to Beersheba. I think he's English. And did a whole bunch of drawings of what he found in the wells down in Beersheba. This is a drawing of a real well down in Beersheba. It was 12 feet across. And it was lined around the edges with these big stones in that picture. And some of the stones, I think you can see it on one of them, like right here, there's a notch right there. That's the notch from ropes going over it for centuries, pulling water out. So that's probably the nearest thing you're going to get to a picture of one of these wells. So he goes back and it's all done and everyone lives happily ever after. And that was one of the most strange incidents in the entire Old Testament. But we need to make some observations, and we've already touched on a few of them. Why a test at all? I mean, after all, the promises were made. God said the promise is going to come through in your seed. This seems like it seems totally gratuitous. Perhaps it's because of this phrase right here. Genesis 22:2, we read it. Take now your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. That's enough things in a row to tell you that there's a potential problem here, the potential problem being Abraham himself might be starting to place his love for this child above his love for God and his obedience to God's plans. Take your son, your only son, the one that you love. And let's just see where that love is. See if it's out of whack. So could it be that he was in the process perhaps of loving the gift above the giver? That could be. And this is a way for Abraham to understand where that's at. It could also be this, because faith is completed in our actions. And we'll look at this in a section. If Abraham, for instance, trusted God all this time, had Isaac, everything was just looking peachy keen, and then God says, sacrifice him, and Abraham says, I don't think so. Does Abraham really have faith in God's promises? Faith in God's loving kindness toward him? Faith in God's sovereignty? Does he really? Because what he's going to do is he's going to take control and say, I don't think so, I need to control the situation. Like we do in our lives. His faith in that particular case would be demonstrated to be not really faith. See what I'm saying? So actions tend to follow faith. Actions tend to follow belief. We talk about this a lot, and I just did this. Stepping onto an airplane, there's that moment, I did it this week, where you step off that jetway, and you can look down between your legs, and you can see the tarmac under the plane, in that little crack right down there. And you go, ooh, I'm on the jetway, and now I'm on the airplane. I did that twice going in this last time. Well, I wouldn't take that step on the airplane unless my faith, which says I believe in the trustworthiness and the safety of this plane, if I don't take that step and say, sure, Boeing 747s are safe, I don't think so. If I don't take the step, my faith isn't really faith. And it's the action that helps me understand where my faith is. See? It's the action that helps me understand my faith. So maybe that's the case. And in fact, the writer, James, tells about this, and we're going to read this really quick here. You know, someone may well say, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without the works, and I'll show you my faith by my works. And he goes on and says, you know, you believe that God is one. Well, you do well. The demons also believe, and they shudder. But are you willing to recognize, you foolish fellow, that faith without works is useless? The useless word means it's not operable. It means it's lazy. It means it's idle. It does nothing. It's a faith that has nothing to it. Unless I step on the plane, I don't really have faith. When I step on the plane, I know I have faith. Okay? That's what he's saying. You foolish fellow, faith without works is useless. There's Abraham. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he offered up Isaac his son on the altar? You see that faith was working with his works, and as a result of the works, faith was perfected. And the scripture was fulfilled, which says, and Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. And he was called the friend of God. You see that a man is justified by works and not by faith alone. Now, some of you are saying, wait, I thought we were saved by faith through grace. Absolutely true. But what the writer James is saying is unless you actually take that step, unless that action follows that faith, you may not have real faith. How will I know if I have real faith? Watch your actions. Just watch your actions. What you really truly believe, what you truly have faith in, will demonstrate in its actions. That's why he's saying the people during his time, James says, if they're walking around saying, I have faith, God is one, and yet their actions don't match those statements, there's something wrong with their faith. Don't have to be perfect.
You don't have to work towards the works.
No.
But having the Holy Spirit within us and Christ in us,
The works,
it is a product.
the works are a product. Right. The works are a product. The works are a product of a faith that already exists. That's why he says, at the end he says, and not by faith alone. If that faith doesn't somehow evidence itself in how you do your life, then you may not believe it. And so for Abraham, this is a moment perhaps where he goes through this and suddenly he realizes, you know, my heart really is given to God. I do understand the depth of my faith in God because I'm willing to let my son go, who should mean everything to me. Yeah. That's right, justified. So a whole believer who has real faith is someone whose actions come out of that faith. I step on the plane, I trust God, and I go with what he says. When he says, go here, I go, I don't get it, but I'll go there. That's what a real faith is. A real faith is demonstrated. Okay, another thing. Did you notice that there was an only son that was given? Some interesting parallels. So I thought I'd pull out a couple of parallels. Here's one of many. 1 John 4:9. By this the love of God was manifested in us, that God has sent his only begotten Son into the world so that we might live through him. And by the way, while we're thinking about this, that phrase only begotten Son, we don't use it a lot in English. But what it's saying in the Greek is it's exactly the title you'd give to an only son. You only have one son, the only son, and he's yours. It was what you would say for an only son who was an only son. It's a word that means none like him. So you can always, in only begotten son, you can say his only nobody like him son is what that means. So that's like an only son. He gave an only son, kind of prefiguring for us what God through Jesus was going to do. Another parallel, the son who bore the tree of his own sacrifice. Do you notice that Isaac carried the wood for his own sacrifice? And Jesus carried the cross? John 19:17, the account, they took Jesus therefore, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of the skull, which is called in Hebrew Golgotha. Interesting parallels. Gosh, what a coincidence. No, not a coincidence. It's a prefiguring type to get us to be able to understand when the true seed of Abraham comes, Jesus. You'd recognize him. Another one, this substitutionary death. Did you notice that? There was someone who was brought in, this ram that brought in to substitute for Isaac, to substitute for him. That, by the way, is the substitutionary death and sacrifices is a very uncommon idea in the ancient world. Normally, if you've seen some really bad science fiction movies, normally you have a race of agrarian idiots who don't know anything, and so to appease God, they take some of the stuff that they grow, because God, after all, gives them fertility and brings the product of that fertility to the ground. They offer it to the God, hoping that God will continue to provide fertility for the ground if you give them part of your offering. And as a result, since fertility goes not only to corn, but it also goes to children, every now and then you had to sacrifice a child. That is classic ancient thinking about sacrifice to God. The idea of a substitutionary sacrifice, this is breaking new ground. This is way breaking new ground. Not just trying to appease the gods so that they maintain this blessing of fertility, but somehow offer something to God substitutionarily for what you owe. Brand new idea right here. So sure enough, here's Peter says in 1 Peter 3:18, "For Christ also died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust, so that he might bring us to God." Substitutionary sacrifice. So, no more middleman. I love that phrase. You know, John 3:16, you always know. Add 2 to it, John 3:18, and make it 1 Peter 3:18, you get there. Okay, now you know. Okay. Another one. God will provide the substitute, Jehovah Jireh. God will provide. John 3:16, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son." He gave. His monogenes, his unique, the only one. It doesn't say for God so loved the world that you're going to have to pay the price for yourself. It says he gave. So God provides. So here, there's a problem for mankind, that's sin. And God provides a solution. Jehovah Jireh. God will provide. And God provides a lamb for us, Jesus, as John the Baptist said, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." He's provided. That's meant to be prefigured here as well, so you'd get it. By the way, it's another reason why you go through these parallels and you think, when Jesus came during first century Palestine and the Pharisees, who were so well taught in the Old Testament, they know this story. Why is it that they couldn't look at what happens to Jesus and go, wait a second, Isaac, the only son given, the substitutionary death, carrying the, they missed it. But this story is meant for them to catch it, to largely catch it. And some did. Finally, the promise defies death itself. You notice there's something about what Abraham understood here. I mean, he understood very well the promise because it had been made to him many times in the story already. But even when death now seemed like a roadblock to the moving on of that promise, Abraham thinks, no biggie. Death itself is not even big enough to get in the way of this locomotive train we call God's promise to mankind for life with him. Death itself doesn't even get in the way. Death of Jesus doesn't get in the way, and even our death doesn't get in the way. Death doesn't. Which is why you have this passage right here. 1 Corinthians 15, Paul quotes, "Then will come about the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory. O death, where is your victory? O death, where is your sting?" Death is just a minor player in the story of life now. It's not the ultimate end of everything. It's just a side player. In the ancient world, death was the inevitable end for all of us. And rightly so, because, well, people were dying everywhere. And I think I mentioned this before, but there's a great reverse in pictures right here when it says death is swallowed up. For them, there was an ancient story that went through many, many ancient cultures, that death was like a gigantic fish whose mouth was so large, like a whale mouth, is so large that it opened its mouth and it just sucked in all mankind, and they all died in this fish called death. Oh. Right? That was the idea. Mankind was swallowed up. They would say mankind was swallowed up by death. And so when the writer here writes it, he says, nah, death is swallowed up in victory. So even death itself has no effect on the promise. It's going to happen. Okay, one archaeology minute. Can we do this? Okay. It just turns out a very funny thing happened back in the Middle East in the early 20th century. They found this thing. What? Yeah, so just here's a side view of it. It's found in 1929. It's in the British Museum. I saw it. It's the strangest thing. It was gold leaf that was applied to a piece of wood. The wood had rotted over time and smashed flat, and they took the gold that was the gold leaf that was on top of the statue for the ram, and they just pushed out the gold leaf. And when they've got finished done pushing it out, they had the picture of a ram stuck in a bush. Date? Well, they dated to between 2600 and 2400 BC. Abraham, 2200 BC. Where did they find this? Ur of the Chaldees. Where did Abraham come from? Ur. What does that mean? I don't know. But this image of this animal stuck in a plant, in a tree, is something that I'm sure Abraham knew about. So because it somehow was celebrated in Ur, in pagan Ur, a generation or two before Abraham. Very strange. By the way, if you want to go somewhere closer in the British Museum, there's a pair of these they found in the pit. One's actually in Philadelphia. So it's kind of strange. That's our still little archaeological moment. But just to let you know, this is probably not the same ram in the thicket from this story, because it preceded by a century or two the story with Abraham. But it is still nonetheless very, very odd that as a picture, this is the solution to the substitutionary death in Abraham's story. Maybe there's a lot of rams stuck in trees that we really don't know. Yeah, very strange thing. So as we wrap up this story today, remember the fact that God never does anything by accident. God has taken the story of the sacrifice of Isaac, the one through whom the promise would come, and made him to look so similar to the real seed that would come later through Jesus, that mankind should look, and especially the Jews should look and say, hey, wait a second. Is that just like Abraham offering his only son? For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that if you believe in him, you won't perish but have everlasting life. Is this the same picture? It's the same picture. That's one way we know, and so does the Apostle Paul know, that when we talk about Abraham, the promise through his seed, that seed is indeed Jesus himself. Jesus himself. And through him, blessings to all the nations. So the further back you go in the Old Testament, the more you start seeing the New Testament, prefigured to get us ready for the real Messiah, Jesus, when he'd come. So in the future, when God asks you to sacrifice your only son, or something as crazy, you got to ask yourself, will I let go of my control of the future, or do I trust that God knows what he's doing and he loves me? And I'll just give you one short example and we'll quit with that. There was, many of you know, we used to live in Spokane, Washington. Before coming here, we lived in Spokane. Lived there for 2 decades plus. And I was convinced that that's where we were going to die. Well, we were going to live the rest of our lives. It just wasn't hostile. But I mean, that was going to be the place. And we really loved Spokane. Spokane was just a tremendous place. I really, really, really liked it. Grew very attached, had all of our kids there. At the time I was working for Hewlett-Packard, I got a call from a vice president of Hewlett-Packard saying, we want to hire you for a job in California. What do you think? And I said, does that mean relocating? Well, yes, it means relocating. And I said, oh, Spokane. So I remember hanging up the phone thinking, this is a great opportunity. You know, when a vice president of a $10 billion company calls you, you say, well, sure. And so, but I didn't want to say sure because Spokane, I just loved Spokane. I remember agonizing over this for a week or so as I told this vice president, I'll call you back when I have my decision. It was agonizing for me because I loved the place. The place in a sense had become an idol for me. I loved it so much. I remember one night staying awake and I couldn't sleep, and I went out in the living room. I just threw myself on the floor and I said, God, if this place has become an idol for me and I love it so much, I'm not willing to follow you. If this is what you want to work for this guy, I just suddenly realized I've got to let go of this place. I've got to. It's become an idol to me. This whole offer has made it apparent in my heart where this place has become in my heart. So God, I let go of this place. I let go. You know, if you want me to take this thing, I'll say yes to the guy. So after that very sleepless night, after letting go of the idol that Spokane had been to me, I got a call from this vice president 2 days later, and he said, never mind, we're closing the job offer. And I said, what? And I looked at God and said, what? Why did you make me go through this? Why did you make me go through this whole week of agony trying to let go of what Spokane had become in my heart, this idol that had become? I loved it so much. Why did you make me do this? And years later, his answer was, so you could get that out of the way before I gave you the big one. Go to Utah.
I was just going to say that. Somewhere's in there, you got a chance to come here.
Yeah, and if you know the consequences or the circumstances of how we came to be here, there was enough to deal with at the time. It had nothing to do with Utah and a lot to do back there. But the whole idea of God asking me to give it up, and it was a real offer to give it up, and finally giving that up is God's way of saying, I need to get you past these steps in your faith one at a time, and it's going to take an actual test for you to understand where your heart's at. And for Abraham, that's exactly what happened to him. It's going to give you a test so you can understand where your heart's at.
I feel so proud of myself that we got you.
I know.
Really?
I know. That's exactly right. Yeah, like a lamb caught in the thicket. Here we are like lambs caught in the thicket. Oh, we could do that sometime. What brought me here? And the bottom line is God brought me here. But in God's graciousness and his kindness and his gentleness, he took one of the biggest issues I'd have to deal with and allowed me to do it 2 years ahead of time. Praise God. That's why he does that. And it wasn't until a test allowed you to understand your heart and to get past that. And I think that's what happened to Abraham. Okay, let's pray. Father, we do indeed thank you for your tremendous word. It just amazes me every time I read it. And there's more to see, there's more to learn, there's more to challenge my heart. There's more that causes me to draw near to you in ways it hadn't before. It seems to be almost alive and active, and you say it is. God, I ask that if there's any of us here who are dealing with a test like this right now, a test that fundamentally is about letting go of something else we've turned into our idol in replacement for following your call, that you'd make it clear in our hearts, that you'd help us through it, that you'd give us an understanding of where our heart's devotion has been misplaced, so that we won't be disappointed by that thing we've placed our devotion in. God, we want our hearts to be solely devoted to you in all that we are, our heart, our soul, our mind, our strength, all that we are. We want our devotion, our hope, our love to be placed on you, because you never disappoint, and you're always right. Your loving kindness for us never ceases. Your mercies are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. So thank you for your great love to us. And Father, thank you for tests that give us an understanding about how we need to replace our devotion to you. Thanks now in Jesus' name. Amen.